It's 5:03, so I think we can start. And I think we'll just start by doing some introductions. So my name is Jana Gajdošová, and I am a medieval specialist at Sam Fogg, 15D Clifford Street, if you've never been to visit our gallery. My speciality is medieval architecture, not monastic architecture. Secular architecture specifically. I worked on a medieval bridge for as my PhD topic. But this is why we actually have Michael Carter here. I invited him to have this chat with me as we prepare an exhibition. And I will go to the next slide. And I'm really happy that, Michael, you said yes, and that you were willing to be here today. So Michael Carter is a senior properties historian for English heritage, and his focus specifically is monastic art and history, monastic books and libraries, and the dissolution of monasteries. And Michael's published extensively on these themes, but I would also just like to flag up his recent book, which was published in 2019, and it's entitled The Art and Architecture of the Cistercians in Northern England, 1300 to 1540. So he's really the perfect person to have here today to unpack some of the questions that have surfaced as I prepare this upcoming exhibition at our gallery. So just a little bit about the exhibition. I'll go to the next slide. The title of the exhibition is Those Who Pray, Monastic Communities in Medieval Europe. And the name, Those Who Pray, comes from this philosophy that medieval society saw itself divided into three parts: those who work, those who fight, and those who pray. And so that's how we sort of came up with the name. And so we'll see how this exhibition goes. Maybe this will lead on to a sort of a trilogy of exhibitions, but we have to wait to see. Now, the aim of the exhibition, and I suppose our webinar today, is really to explore the visual culture of those communities that lived in medieval monasteries, nunneries, and these various organized religious communities. We hope to show how these communities acquired artworks, and then also what happened to those artworks during the French Revolution, during the dissolution of the monasteries here in England. And the show itself is very inclusive, very wide-ranging, and so it includes lots of different objects from sculpture, manuscripts, stained glass, textiles, and they range from the 12th all the way to the 16th centuries and come from a wide range of European countries as well. And this inclusive context also means that the objects in the exhibition are linked to the theme of the show in a broad way. And so everyone from a hermit living in a cave on his own to monks and nuns that live according to what's called a rule, which we will discuss with Michael, to communities of priests are really considered here as we sort of prepare the exhibition. And so I thought really that we could start with doing a little introduction by you, Michael, if you don't mind, to unpack this a little bit more and to talk about those monastic communities that existed in the medieval period. What kinds of monastic communities were there? If you could just give us a little, I know it's a huge question, but if you could give us a little sort of run through.
Yeah, I'll do my very best. And thank you very much for the warmth of that introduction. And I'm really honoured to be here tonight and to work with you on putting together this exhibition. So, as Jana said, I'm a senior properties historian at English Heritage, and I write historical interpretations and do historical research on the 60 or 70 or so monasteries which are in the care of English Heritage. They're vested into the care of English Heritage by the state. And monasticism has been a feature of Christianity since the days of the early church, when people like St. Anthony Abbot and St. Pacomus and St. John Stylites went out into the desert to escape the sins and temptations of the late Roman world to find a more Christ-like way of living. And they originally lived as hermits, what's called the eremitical way of life. Now, life as a hermit was pretty dangerous in both put you forward from loads of moral trepidation. There's very famously the temptation of St. Anthony, which was a source of inspiration for artists throughout the Middle Ages, perhaps most famously by Hieronymus Bosch, tempted into sin. And it's also physically dangerous. So these hermits started to coalesce together as kinds of loose communities. And you start to get these more organized communities from the 4th, 5th century onwards, and they spread throughout the late Roman Empire, both east and west. And they're certainly a feature of Christianity here in the Latin West, in Gaul, the Roman provinces of Gaul, by the late 4th, early 5th century. And they live according to, Jana's already indicated this, these organized communities live according to a rule, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those are. Now, the dominant form of monastic life in Western Europe comes to be that governed by the rule of St. Benedict, and he's a late Roman chap, and he founds a monastery at Monte Cassino, writes a rule for it, which is disseminated across Europe, especially from the 9th century onwards. We also have other rules. There's the rule of St. Augustine, and you get various monastic reform movements, which we'll be talking about, such as the Cluniacs and the Cistercians, the most successful of them. And then you also get orders of friars as well, who live together as a monastic community, but go out into the world. You have what are called the regular canons, and they're priests who live together as a monastic community, their life governed by the rule of St. Augustine. And I hope I haven't given too much of a male influence to this, because from the very, very outset, there's a very strong female dimension to monasticism as well. I think Scholastica, the first Benedictine female saint, for instance. In fact, there's a female equivalence for all the founders of monastic traditions, well, almost all of them. And the female monastic presence is very, very important throughout the Middle Ages as well. So that's a very, very quick run through of what I'll be talking about. And we'll be unpacking a lot more of this and talking about some of these names, some of these orders, and what actually life within a monastery consisted of as well. That separation from the world, your dedication of your rule to Christ, living what's quite an austere life structured around prayer, devotional reading, and for some orders as well, especially earlier in the Middle Ages, hard manual graft.
Yeah, I know the question is so broad. I mean, you could do a whole webinar or a series of webinars really just on that question, just unpacking all the different communities. One of the things that you mentioned just briefly as you were running through was St. Augustine, and this idea of the rule. And so I wanted to just bring in the next slide, which is this amazing historiated initial L, which actually has this wonderful image of St. Augustine seated on a throne, and he's granting the monastic rule to a nun on his right and a monk on his left. So you can see him holding these two scrolls with writing on it. And so I thought we could just use this as a kind of a springing point to talking about this idea of living according to a rule and what that means. What is a rule?
Yeah, and there we can see Augustine there wearing his mitre. He's Bishop of Hippo Regius. He's a kind of late Roman party boy who is destined for a career in the civil service and finds God whilst in Milan. And there's a very, very wonderful description of his conversion in what he calls the Confessions. And he speaks about St. Ambrose as a man who showed him kindness, someone who is instrumental in his conversion. And he goes back to Hippo Regius, and a community, a monastic community coalesces around him. And I think it's very fitting that we have both a nun and a canon there kneeling and wearing the black habits of Augustinians, because from the outset, women were a very, very important presence in St. Augustine's vision of monasticism. And the rule that he writes or is attributed to him is a collection of writings, and it's the first monastic rule of all. And it sort of, I think it has 8 chapters. It provides a guide to how to live a rigorous life, as a rigorous life excluded from the world, but live harmoniously as a community. Now, there's something called the rule of the master as well. That's very much longer, emerges from the late Roman, post-Roman world, and provides a very important source of the rule of St. Benedict and its various chapters, which Benedict calls the little rule for beginners, and it covers almost every single aspect of life within a monastery. The rule of the master is actually much more detailed, has many more chapters, and even includes some regulations, how to deal with events which are far too naughty for me to be talking about at this time of the evening. And but it's a general guide for how to conduct life within a monastery. It says you what kind of a guy, and the female version of it, what kind of a woman the abbess should be, the head of the monastery, the qualities that the cellarer, the person in charge of the monastery's provision, should be, how to sing the 8 offices that punctuate the monastic day, these 8 services which are sung by monastic communities. They gather in their church 8 times a day, the first time around 2 a.m. in the morning, the last it was about 7, 8 o'clock at night, after which they go to bed to sing praise to the Lord, songs of praise, and how to the importance of silence within the community, how to deport themselves at all time. It's a fascinating read, and it gives you an idea of the rigors of the monastic life.
Yeah. We also have related to that, I mean, very directly related to that, we have this manuscript in the exhibition that does very much the same thing. It was made by and for medieval nuns, and it includes not only the chant and liturgy, but also these chapters, as you mentioned, outlining the rules that govern the daily life in one of these like amazing convents in Renaissance Siena, in 16th century Siena. And it also has this incredibly remarkable punched binding, which has on the cover the convent's patron saint, Saint Mary Magdalene. So you can see that on the left here on the slide. But I found it, when I was working on this, I found it so fascinating just to read some of these chapters and to look at some of these topics that they cover, like confession, dress and bedding, silence in the cells. Silence is a huge thing in these books. Sins of various degrees, and also how to elect an abbess, for example. And I just got a quote here because I thought, it'd be nice to sort of like just bring a quote from one of these books. So this is from this particular manuscript, which is in the exhibition. And there is one chapter there that talks about silence while eating, or there's one sort of section and it talks about silence while eating. And it says, the nuns maintain total silence while eating. And if in need to speak, they do so in short and at a low voice. If any nun makes a noise, laughs, acts disorderly, or makes agitated gestures or similar, the abbess reprimands and corrects her accordingly. And I just found that so amazing. I mean, many of us probably get annoyed by people making agitated gestures or similar when eating. So I understand why that rule was made. But I think these manuscripts also are such an important direct source of information about the life in a convent, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think the popular imagination books are so rightly associated with life within medieval monasteries. The idea of going back to the Name of the Rose, there's an awful lot to popularize it. Monks and nuns copying out their manuscripts, reading them as well. Bit of disappointment for fans of the Name of the Rose. Very few monasteries would have had a scriptorium or reading room on the scale of that depicted in the novel or the later film. They did most of their reading and writing in the drafty cloister alleys or on a foul day in the chapter house. But here we are. We have this beautiful Renaissance hand, don't we? And we have a couple of the constitutions written out there. Now, the constitutions are an expansion on the rule. Now, the rule gives you the basic guide to what life within the monastery should be like, but then you also have what are called books of customs and constitutions which really expand on them. And in England, one of the most important books of sort of constitutions or customs is the monastic constitutions of Lanfranc, written for monastery in Canterbury. And it's interesting you should mention silence. Now, silence was hugely important to monastic communities. There's no such thing as a rule of silence, but I just think that the fact that people think there is shows how it's so deeply embedded in the monastic life. And it's all about humility. It's all about dedicating your life to God. It's all about obedience to the abbot, that kind of thing of don't speak until you're spoken to. A couple of periods a day are set aside for necessary conversation in the cloister, or a room just off the cloister where you can speak. It's interesting that you mentioned about in the refectory and the importance of silence. Well, silence is so important that monasteries developed their own lexicons of sign language as a way of communicating what is necessary. And with food in mind, this is the sign language for cheese, the sort of replicate cheese press. And a piece of monastic sign language is in regular use today. And something done to me an awful lot as a kid is to shut up, is to maintain that silence. But again, I think this is a remarkable manuscript, given the instructions for the conduct of life within the monastery, and having that image there, that beautiful illumination of St. Mary Magdalene, or St. Mary Magdalene, to use the medieval English pronunciation, there with her jar containing the unction, her long hair, her cloak, the fallen woman come good through belief in Christ. And indeed, monasteries were founded. This is Sienese, isn't it? And or is it Florence? And especially in Italy, for the conversion of fallen women, that nobody was beyond redemption, and the monastic and monasteries played a huge part in the dissemination of the message and as avenue for salvation. And I just sort of think, just to unpack things a bit further, we talked about monks and we talked about friars and we talked about canons. And I think the first thing to say about monks and canons is it's essentially quite a selfish vocation, quite a selfish way of life, that you are concerned there with your personal salvation. It's a way of escaping the sinful earth. It's like those hermits in the Middle East in the 4th century, the very foundations of monasticism. You retreat to the monastery as a way of getting away from this sinful world. It's about securing your personal salvation, fostering your personal relationship with God. This is from a convent of Augustinian sisters of Augustinian hermits, or what we call Austin friars, Augustinian friars. Martin Luther was originally an Augustinian friar. And the friars are about taking the message to people, that although they're under monastic vows, it's about taking the message to the people to try and help them via preaching and example, secure the salvation of the populace.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just thinking back to that idea of the title and those three of that division of society in the Middle Ages, I suppose, although we can see it as quite selfish, I suppose the medieval society saw these people as contributing because they were there praying for everybody else's. Their contribution was the prayer.
Yeah, I mean, the prayer factories, it's one way of putting it. These monasteries are, they're praying for the salvation of a sinful world. We're all, it's and especially once you get the development of the concept of purgatory, virtually everybody has the chance of salvation, and the prayers being said by monks and nuns within monasteries is going to help you shorten your stay in purgatory. And even before that, thinking about how I'm sure there are a lot of people have come to the Middle Ages in more recent years through things like Game of Thrones, and boy, the sinfulness, the sex and violence depicted in Game of Thrones was nothing to what is attributed to some early medieval aristocrats, and they knew they were going to burn in all eternity, for all eternity, unless they made good. And one way of making good was to found a monastery where, to quote the foundation charter of Battle Abbey, founded in the aftermath of the Battle of Hastings in 1066, a field soaked in blood. There are descriptions of blood running down the hillside, you know, founded by William the Conqueror as an act of penance for what he did, and it is to make good the bloodshed through a never-ending round of good works. Now, the main good work is the singing of the services, but there's ancillary services that go along with that as well. And people are eager to be buried within the confines of a monastery, believing the prayers that are said there will get them on an express elevator up to heaven. And for people a little bit lower down the social scale, well, there's something called a confraternity you can sign up to, where you get all the spiritual benefits as if you were a fully paid up member of the community as well. But even just contributing a farthing would get your name down in what's the Book of Life, the Liber Vitae, placed on the monastery's altar and read through in full once a year, prayers being said for the salvation of your souls. Having a member of your family go into a monastery was also a very, very good thing indeed as well. They're real avenues for social mobility, monasteries. We might be talking about that in some detail.
Yeah, that actually leads quite well into my next question, because I wanted to just sort of unpack a little bit more what life in monastery was really, you know, in a monastery was really like. And specifically, I wanted to talk about the differences in the quality of life based on the type of family that you come from, or the money that your family was able to donate to the community. So I just wondered if you could say something about the preservation of status within a monastery, or none, or no preservation of status.
Yeah, interesting. Well, you're not supposed to have any status at all, are you? It's like you have dedicated your life to God, and you are all, in theory at least, equal. Or if you get, you know, and if you have any pride, that should be trampled out of you. You know, when you get descriptions of people who have adapted especially well to the monastic life. Let's think about some sort of saints associated with English heritage sites, monastic saints associated with English heritage sites, such as St Cuthbert, the great saint of Lindisfarne, or St Aelred of Rievaulx. Gosh, you know, the lives, the hagiographical lives that are written of those, how well they adapt to the monastic life and take on its humiliations and its hardships without any concern for their own status. It's doing what they're supposed to do as monks. But you have to ask us some questions here. Well, what are the avenues for entering a monastery? First of all, to be a monk or nun, you've really got to be Latin literate. And okay, you know, early on in the Middle Ages, it's like, you know, still the lingua franca, and most people in the former provinces of the Roman Empire would have had a command of it. Getting into the 12th century, well, it's only really an educated elite who are going to have some kind of a command of Latin. Yeah. And then also your family has got to be able to spare you from labour. And so, you know, being able to spare a son or daughter to go into, if they have the monastic vocation, to go into that as well. You get something called lay brothers and sisters, and an order especially associated with them are the Cistercians, but I think we're going to talk about them a little bit more, but you get them from fairly early on, lay brothers and sisters, certainly from the foundation of Cluniac monasteries, 10th, 11th century. And they do not have to be Latin literate. They serve God with their labour. And in theory, they're not supposed to be of a lower status, but some social divisions do creep in. And later on in the Middle Ages, you do get rich widows retiring to monasteries and living a quasi kind of monastic life. There's a classic example is Denny Abbey in Cambridgeshire, which is a monastery of Poor Clares, they're Franciscan nuns, and its founding patron is Mary St Paul. She is the Countess of Pembroke, and she retires there with a suite of ladies in waiting, and kind of leads a monastic life, but very much on an aristocratic level. And there are other things we need to get in there as well. I think, you know, I think I answered all your questions.
Yeah.
Said, you know.
No, you did. I just brought in, as you were talking about, you know, these wealthy widows and so on. I just brought in this image with this amazing cope that's in the exhibition, but also a little fragment of an Opus Anglicanum with Saint Etheldreda, because, you know, she's a nun, but she's wearing this amazing crown, and so it really kind of speaks to what you were mentioning, you know, that, you know, if you were a wealthy, you know, princess in this case, you'd probably have a little bit more flexibility with the way you followed the rule. And
well, let's talk about Etheldreda. This is very interesting. She is indeed a princess, and she does indeed found a monastery, or a monastery perhaps founded for her, or goes in one that's recently founded. 7th century England is a time when the peoples of Anglo-Saxon England are converting to Christianity, and you get these dual monasteries, like Etheldreda's, or like the monastery of St Hilda, Whitby, or St Milberger, Wenlock. Those are English heritage sites, and they have a princess, a royal abbess at their head. You know, these are houses of monks and nuns, but they're headed up by a royal abbess. And it gives you a status of, it gives you an idea of the status of women in the Anglo-Saxon church, the important part they play in the evangelization of Anglo-Saxon England. You also get them in the Frankish in origin, the very famous one in what's now northern France. But definitely, you get posh people going into monasteries, but they're not supposed to preserve that status. The rule of St Augustine goes on about that you shouldn't be in awe of somebody because they're quite posh and you've never interacted with somebody like that before. They enter at the same level. Now, posh people are very, very important benefactors of monasteries. And I just think that, you know, the sumptuousness of what you're looking at there gives you an idea. And I mean, I'm a sucker for a little bit of ecclesiastical embroidery. I can remember as a little boy being bored out of my mind during Mass, but quite fascinated by the colours of the vestments and the incense. The sensory experience of worship really captured me. And these two things here give you an idea of the beauty and sumptuousness of the possessions of monasteries. Now, people gave to the monasteries because it was honouring God, and, you know, it is a proclamation of their status as well. But also, when you're giving to a monastery, those gifts are recorded, it becomes part of the institutional memory of a monastery, and it is rewarded with prayers for the salvation of your soul. That wonderful cope there, where you can see in the middle, I think it's the Assumption of the Virgin, isn't it? I might be, you know, and often where that is, you would often sometimes have someone's coat of arms or rebus, a little device that plays on their name. Very, very significant when you have things on the back of vestments, because most of the liturgy is celebrated with priests facing the altar. So all you can see is the back of the vestment for most of the Mass. It's a reminder to pray for whoever paid for that. But patronage of monasteries wasn't just restricted to the elites. Monks, abbots and prioress, abbots, priors, abbesses, prioresses, even individual monks and nuns made very, very important contributions to the art and architecture of their own monasteries as well. Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire is an excellent example that much of what the monastery you can see dates to the abbacy of Abbot Aelred, later a saint, 1147 to 67, and it really reflects and embodies his vision of what monasticism should be like. And then going to the other end of the Middle Ages, when the last great patron of the monastery was a guy called John Burton, abbot there just at the turn of the 16th century. And he also leaves an imprint on the monastery, reshaping it for what a monastery should be like in the 16th century. And, you know, and monasteries is often talking about elites. It really is. But we shouldn't forget that people throughout society were involved within them. And as I mentioned, some people with very, very little indeed were benefactors of monasteries. And their contributions might not have been as visible, but was certainly rewarded with spiritual services, the saying of masses, the saying of prayers.
Yeah, And I suppose one thought that came into my mind is that we also shouldn't forget that they produced, these incredible manuscripts, until a certain point that were exclusively made just in monasteries. So they had this kind of immediate connection to great art. And to very expensive art. Probably the most expensive art that was made in the Middle Ages was made in monasteries.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you can find evidence of crafts and even craftswomen actually, in most media being intimately associated with monasteries, actually being monks or nuns themselves. When you find such and such a monk is named as being a master mason, or a glazier, or a metal worker. And using Battle Abbey as an example again, a chronicle written by the monks there in the 12th century mentions what's going on in the nearby town of Battle that exists because of the monastery, and it mentions there are goldsmiths there. And why are they making gold? Why do they have a goldsmith at Battle? It's to make luxury altar bling for the monastery there as well. Book production is really interesting. Yep. Monks and nuns are rightly associated with book production and book ownership, and that's something that goes on throughout the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
They're also consumers of books as well. They're buying them in as well. But having said that, they are still producing incredible manuscripts right up until the end of the Middle Ages. Furness Abbey in the background there in the early 15th century, its abbot commissions a magnificent 2-volume cartulary. That's a collection of the charters granting the monasteries estates, and it's got these fantastic little portrait illuminations of the donors or their coats of arms, where the monk scribe and the monk illuminator are named and identified in it. And then, but they're, as I said, they're also buying books, and that includes printed books. For instance, at the very end of the Middle Ages, Byland Abbey, to use another example, is buying books from a vestment. However wonderful, we've got a vestment on the screen. Someone called John Lokesmith, a vestment maker in York, and Byland Abbey is buying printed books from him. That association with books endures until the very end of the Middle Ages.
Yeah. And going on from vestments, one thing that I wanted to mention with the next slide, I'm just thinking we kind of got lost with our discussion, but I wanted to just think a little bit about the kinds of things that monks and nuns wore and what they looked like. And we have this amazing image, which is the initial A from that's on a leaf from a gradual that's going to be in the exhibition. And you saw a slightly larger image of that on that very first slide that I showed. And I love this image because I think when anybody thinks of a monk, this is probably the image that pops into their minds, a man with the top part of his hair shaved off. And so I sort of thought it'd be really interesting for our viewers if you could just explain what these monks are wearing here, and the tonsure. What's the tonsure about?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you've introduced a bit of a nerdy term there, haven't you? Yeah. So we got their tonsure. That means the top of their head is shaved, and it's from, I think it's a Latin word to shave, I think. And then they're wearing a distinctive set of garments, habits, and also I'll talk about the facial hair presently as well. That's very, very interesting that they've got some facial hair. So we know of monks shaving their heads, we've got documentary evidence of it, firm documentary evidence of it from fairly early on, in some 6th, 7th century, probably much earlier than that as well. And around that time, the evidence from England tells us that there were 3 types of monastic tonsure, 3 types of monastic hairstyle. Now, there's the one we can see there, which is shaving the top of the head. And now that comes to dominate. That's the Roman tonsure. And it's meant to be the hair, the tonsure of St. Peter. probably just means that Bede, who's our source for this, the Venerable Bede, great historian of the early English church, and his contemporaries were familiar with early depictions from Rome and elsewhere of a bald-headed, male pattern baldness, St. Peter, bald top of the head. And that becomes the dominant kind of tonsure. It's said to be to represent the crown of thorns. There were two other kinds of tonsure. There was the Eastern tonsure, which involved the complete shaving of the head, and Archbishop Theodore of Canterbury couldn't set off until to take up his see until he's from Tarsus, and he's a Greek monk in Rome, and he can't set off until his hair has grown out so he can take the circular tonsure. And then there's another type, the Irish tonsure. It's often incorrectly called Celtic tonsure, which is a kind of male pattern baldness to the front that you've shaved ear to ear. And it's one of the things that causes that settled at the famous Synod of Whitby when in 664, when they decide the date of Easter, is about the style of the tonsure, and they decided all things Roman, so that type of tonsure predominates. It's a way of marking yourself out, of distinguishing yourself. Hairstyles matter today, an awful lot today, as an expression of identity. And that was the case in the late Roman and the post-Roman worlds as well. It's a visible sign of your separation from society, and also how you dressed as well. Now, we don't know what early monastic habits were like, but certainly by the 8th, 9th century, we're starting to get distinguished habits distinguishing monks as belonging to a monastic order. Now, they're wearing brown habits, which were actually in actual fact grey, and they're the Grey Friars, they're Franciscans, but the colour of habit differs between orders. Benedictines wear black habits, also to Augustinian canons and friars. Cistercians wear white habits, as do Carthusians and Premonstrantensian canons as well. You have what are called the Black Friars, the Dominicans. They wear a black cloak over a white habit. You have the White Friars, who are the Carmelites, and these habits they're made out of good wool. You get monks entering monasteries and expressing surprise and delight for the first time in their life that they've got a decent woolen garment. But they're also meant to be simple, and they're meant to be distinctive, and the various orders go to great lengths to try and maintain how the distinctive pattern and colour of their habits, and not to let them sort of shade the distinction shade between orders. And it's the same for nuns as well. Now, nuns don't take the tonsure, they don't have their head shaved, but they have their hair cut. And there are some wonderful manuscript illuminations of nuns entering monasteries and having their hair cut. Well, at the moment they take their vows and are fully professed as members of the community.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually didn't know that. Didn't know that nuns had to cut their hair before they entered the monastery. Wow. Thank you for that. And I just wanted to point out before we keep going to keep putting your questions in the Q&A box so that we have a nice discussion at the end. Now, moving on, one thing that I wanted to sort of get to, we'd sort of touched upon it already a little bit, but just to talk a little bit more about the kinds of precious objects that would have been in these monasteries. I think it's now sort of accepted that there would have been things like manuscripts, reliquaries, textiles, and various other artworks that, liturgical objects that would have been kept at these monasteries, very expensive ones oftentimes. And so I just wondered whether you could talk a little bit more about that. What kinds of objects were kept in monasteries?
Well, how wonderful that we have a Psalter on the screen now. The singing of the Psalms containing the Psalter formed the core of the monastic day. Raising these songs of praise 8 times a day based around the Psalter. Now, the Cluniacs monks who are an early Benedictine monastic reform movement are especially famous for the sumptuousness of their liturgy and the beauty of their objects, the beauty of holiness. And they got through the entire Psalter. I can't remember how many psalms there are. Is it 109? I'm sure someone will correct me. But they got through that in its entirety in a single day. Other orders set themselves a less ambitious target of getting through it in a week, and you were expected to learn the Psalter off by heart in your year as a novice. But anyway, we have a very, very sumptuous Psalter, and we certainly do have luxury manuscripts from monasteries. A lot of them, the ones that I look at on a routine basis in my research, are often, well, a little bit less sumptuous than this. They're a little bit more work a day, and whoever owned that, or whoever that was commissioned for, boy, were they posh indeed. And and I think that's an important thing to say, that a lot of the things in quotidian, in daily use within monasteries were functional, were good enough, but they had things they kept for very, very, very special days. For instance, at Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, they had a gold and silver altarpiece, which they brought out for what were called principal days. So that would be the great, it was a Cistercian monastery, that would be the Great Feast of the Virgin, Christmas Day, Easter Sunday, some of the feasts of Christ as well. Special altar vessels, the chalices, patens, altar sticks, censers for the incense, which are made of silver or even gold at some monasteries, which are used for the very, very highest of feasts as well. Now, we'll be talking about rates of survival presently, but I'll just tantalize people with this, that the destruction that befell the church in Reformation era England means that not enough chalices survive to this day. Medieval chalices survive from England to service the need of the altars in a large parish church, let alone a monastery. And not a single chalice with a provable monastic provenance survives from medieval England.
Wow, that's quite a statistic there. Yeah, and so, I mean, thinking about all of these objects that would have graced these places, it's also interesting to think about the opposite, the fact that these communities, or some of these communities, were also very much known for rejecting these types of objects and this way of life. And I'm thinking here of the Franciscans, which you've mentioned already, but also the Cistercians that you've kind of touched upon here and there. And, as I mentioned when I introduced you, you are the Cistercian expert, so no pressure. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the Cistercians, their beginnings, and also about how the art that graced their monasteries changed as time went on. Was it the same as when the founder, began this movement, or did it change over centuries?
Well, the Cistercians are probably the most famous monastic reform movement of the Middle Ages. Now, monasticism, almost from its very beginning, went through waves of reform, of trying to, should we really be doing that? And oh gosh, how do we get to a purer interpretation of how to do this? And people are always getting anxious about it. And this is especially the case in the years around the first millennium. Various waves of monastic reform, and you get a group of monks leave the monastery at Molesme and they head off into near a bog, Cistercium, in Burgundy, giving the order its name, Cistercian, to found a monastery, which is a new monastery, which they think is going to provide a much purer interpretation of the rule of St. Benedict. They're kind of getting back to basics, monks. It's cutting back bits of the liturgy they shouldn't really be saying. It's trying to separate yourself ever more from the feudal world. The Cistercians became famous for founding their monasteries far from the concourse of men, as they put it. And then one of the distinctive things about the Cistercians comes to be what's called art historians often think is a very, very pure aesthetic. It's one which rejects most ornament, no colour, no pictures, nothing of great value. And the most famous early Cistercian saint and proponent, especially associated with these simple churches, this very, very pared back aesthetic, is St Bernard of Clairvaux. And he writes something called the Apologia, and I'll just read a little bit about it, and I might lapse into a strident voice to give you the idea of St Bernard. And he goes on about cloisters. He said, "But in the cloister, under the eyes of the brethren who read there, what profit is there in those ridiculous monsters, in the marvellous and deformed comeliness, that comely deformity? Here is a four-legged beast with a serpent's tail, there a fish with a beast's head. Here again the forepart of a horse and half a goat behind it, or a horned beast that bears the hind quarters of a horse. In short, so many and so marvellous are the varieties of diverse shapes on every hand, that are so more tempted to read in the marbles and in our books, and to spend the whole day in wondering at those things, rather than meditating the law of God." And that sort of set a basis for how scholars viewed the Cistercians. And I think to an extent, it's because the rediscovery of Cistercian art and architecture really started to happen in the 19th century, largely due to French scholars in the aftermath of the Revolution, and then English scholars, most of whom were good conforming Anglicans. And it was almost like, the Cistercians were offering a version of monasticism that was palatable to post-revolutionary France and still firmly Protestant England. It's sort of, it was none of this frippery that monks were associated with. Now, the Cistercian aesthetic and the planning of Cistercian monasteries and what was built in the 12th century, it is a remarkable cultural achievement. And anybody who watched Kenneth Clark's Civilization will be aware that he holds them up as being a landmark in the development of civilization in the 12th century. He visits what was then a functioning Cistercian monastery in France. But Cistercians, like any monastic reform movements, continued to reform, and by and large, scholars have taken quite a dim view of that. It's been a deviation from this 12th century ideals, and boy, do we have an example of that deviation in the eyes of many scholars there on the screen there. Could you imagine what St Bernard would have thought about that, having just read that piece? Well, what is it? Gosh, I'll let you try and guess what this is. What kind of a beast is that? Well, also look at the date. It's 1300, so 150 years after St Bernard had lived. Quite a long time. The world had changed an awful lot. And St Bernard himself, as indeed were the founders of the Cistercians, the most successful monastic reform movement, spread explosively across Europe, but they were aware that monasteries had to evolve to survive. And the world of 1300 was radically different from the world of 1100. And looking at that, people would often say, well, that violates, the Cistercians were a really uptight order. They had rules and regulations on just about everything enforced by what was the medieval equivalent of Ofsted inspections from hell called visitations. And then also they had an annual meeting of the general chapter, which passed regulations and rules on everything, and they provided a prism through which to view the history of the order. And oh gosh, the Cistercians had legislation against images. Well, they did in the 12th century, but by the late 13th century, they'd long since applied at all, in practice and in reality. And there would have been nothing controversial about the presence of imagery like that in a Cistercian monastery in 1300. And in actual fact, what I find, the more you look at Cistercian monasteries, even in the 12th century, the more ornament you find. And, I worked about 6 or 7 years ago, possibly even more now, on a project at Rievaulx Abbey, and looking at some of the loose stonework there, I thought, good Lord, that corbel has to be 12th century, and it's exactly the kind of beastie that is being condemned by St Bernard. And it's quite great. Thank you, Jana, for just putting up that image there of of the east end of Rievaulx Abbey, built in around about 1220. And it's one of the glories of early English Gothic architecture, even in its ruinous state. And it's often held up, even to this day, by art historians, popular historians, as being, oh gosh, these Cistercians, look at that, they're really letting things go, aren't they? Well, 1220, so what's that? It's 90 years only after the foundation of the monastery, and Rievaulx keeps going for another 300 years afterwards.
Yeah.
And you have to understand why they built that as well. Well, it is an immensely rich monastery by then, yes. But you can see the low platform, can't you? And that's the high altar. That's where it's now been restored to its original height. And above that, there was a reliquary. It was where the relics of St. Aelred were kept, the monastery's great saint, originally buried in the chapter house, moved or translated here in 1220. And the monks built this extension in honor of him. It was a fitting place for his relics to rest. It was an actual celebration of their piety, the fulfillment of their Cistercian mission.
Yeah, no, it's such an impressive building. And I mean, the Cistercians, in my mind, whenever I think about them, I don't think about ornament, but I think I've been influenced negatively by generalizations of the way that they are written about. But I always think of them as kind of master engineers, because they were master engineers. But I think, having worked on this corbel here, which was thought to have been from the Cistercian Abbey of Belperche in southern France, actually not too far from Moissac, I initially thought, this can't be from Belperche, because we didn't actually, so this photograph that you can see from the 19th century, we didn't actually have that when we first got the sculpture. Only later on did we find this photograph. And it was really interesting, because I thought, gosh, this is meant to be in the refectory. It's circa 1300. So just knowing your research, Michael, I always thought, sure, in the 15th century, the Cistercians had kind of gone rogue, but certainly not by 1300. By 1300, they had no ornament. And to have something like this kind of monster in their refectory where they're eating, seemed so contradictory to me. But then, we found proof that it really does come from the Cistercian Abbey, which kind of just blew my mind a little bit.
I mean, I would encourage, for all sorts of reasons, people to visit Rievaulx Abbey. But go into the museum there, and one of the first things you will see is a fragmentary sculpture of Christ in Majesty. That's Christ sitting in judgment. And that, sculpted around about 1260 to 1280, gives you an idea of just how replete these monasteries were with imagery by that time, and just how wonderful it was. The craftsmanship is exceptional, and it's an expression of belief. Now, monks and nuns didn't just spring out of the ground and like, oh gosh, I'm going to be adherent to a pure ideal. They were informed by the ideals of society around them. And the 12th century world, as I said, was radically different from the late 13th century world, the 14th century world, and the 15th century world. And the monasteries reflected that. And they could think that they were as pure a Cistercian in the 15th century as they were in the 12th. I can remember someone actually asking me about 15th to 16th century Cistercians. Did they not read St. Bernard? And actually, in fact, yes, they did, more than at any time in the Middle Ages. It was in the years around about 1500 that the Cistercians associated themselves with St. Bernard. They actually came to be called the Order of St. Bernard. And unlike so many people today, when they read St. Bernard, they understood what they were reading.
Yeah. No, it's so fascinating. And Michael, I could listen to you for hours, but we are kind of coming to an end. So I thought there's one more topic that I think we sort of have to tackle. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the dissolution of the monasteries. And this picture is sort of perfect for that. Why does this building look like this, first of all? But I just wanted you to also say something about dissolution of the monasteries in England. What sparked it? And was it a gradual process, or was it a quick one?
Wow. Well, it is quick. It's like the 1535, perhaps it starts, and it's all over by 1540. It is remarkably, within the space of 4 or 5 years, a way of life going back 1,000 years is extinguished. Now, there is an enormous literature on the dissolution of the monasteries. A book was recently published by James Clark at Exeter University, giving the latest take on that. It's a bit of a brick, but I thoroughly recommend it. And I'm sure that will spark various other studies as well. Was it because the monasteries were corrupt and no longer fulfilled any useful religious or social functions? That was a traditional English historiographical view. Well, they certainly had their faults, and there were no stronger critics of the monasteries than the monks and nuns themselves, who were very, very conscious of needs to reform. But whether or not that justified their extinction, that's another matter entirely. In fact, as James Clark shows, that some monasteries as late as early 1540 were still anticipating that they might survive. Now, it is also an enormous grab for property and for wealth as well. One of the reasons we know, when I was talking about, sumptuous possessions of monasteries and how little survives. Well, one of the reasons we know how much was there was because commissioners were dispatched around the country to make detailed inventories and records of just what was in monasteries and how much of it was going to be carted off to the royal treasury to be melted down. It phenomenally enriches Henry VIII, money which he, readers of the Wolf Hall novels might remember there's a bit in it where Thomas Cromwell is kind of proto-founder of the NHS, envisaging how all this wealth from the monasteries can go off to fund further education opportunities and things like that. Doesn't really happen. It all gets thrown away basically by Henry in pointless wars and enriching his mates and things like that. He gets a very good price for a lot of it. But the scale of cultural destruction is phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And also it is quite bloody. Now, there are, I think, 30-odd people, 30-odd monastic martyrs around this time, dying for the defense of the monasteries. It doesn't take that many people to be publicly hung, drawn and quartered for, their confreres and sisters think, the pension sounds like a very good idea indeed. And there are hope for a revival in the monastic life as well. Monks, for instance, from Rivaux, stay in touch with one another, remembering in their wills 20 years later their brothers who were with them on the day the monastery fell. And a little bit, the last abbot of Rivaux is a chap called Roland Bellyton. What a fantastic name. I'm not sure he's any relation to Enid. And he had beforehand been an abbot of Rufford in northern Nottinghamshire. And in the reign of Mary, when Catholicism returns and some monasteries are refounded, members of his former community coalesce around him and once again assume their monastic titles. Not far away in Kirklees, there's been a monastery there. It's famous for where Robin Hood was meant to have been died and then been buried. The sisters there, or some of the sisters there, retire to a nearby manor house and try and lead a monastic life. Similarly, the last monks from Denny as well. It isn't necessarily seen as being the final episode, but the destruction is enormous. The scale of the destruction is enormous. The only surviving monastic metalwork, precious metalwork from England, is in the V&A. It's from Ramsey Abbey, and it consists of a thurible, a censer, and an incense bowl. No other precious metal survives from an English medieval monastery.
Yeah, it must have. I mean, it sounds like it must have been a really chaotic system as well. I mean, I know you say that these people were sent to make careful inventories, but I could imagine that wealthy landowners or people who had a little bit of worldly wisdom were also able to creep in and then take some things for themselves.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, actually, it's very, very well organized. I mean, it's a little bit chaotic to start off with. It becomes very well organized indeed, and to the extent of which Sawley Abbey It's on the Yorkshire-Lancashire border, and that's suppressed in one of the first monasteries to come down in 1536, and then it becomes embroiled in a great northern rebellion called the Pilgrimage of Grace, which is partly motivated by the dissolution of the monasteries. That's put down, but a single chalice, and with the royal commissioner in charge of the suppression of the monastery, becomes aware that a chalice has been bribed away from the king, i.e. hidden. And he goes to extraordinary efforts to try and recover it. Now, we do know of individual monks and nuns slipping manuscripts, vestments, even the odd chalice. Well, actually, and sometimes they're given a chalice or a little bit of, oh, you can take that vestment. It's a kind of their, go quietly, that's your deal, go on, it'll be useful for you in the monastic life you have. And there is very, very rare occasions of monasteries being pillaged after they're suppressed. One of the most famous instances is Roach Abbey in South Yorkshire. There's a chap called Michael Sherbrooke, towards the end of the 16th century, based on accounts written by his it's told to him by his father and uncle, writes The Fall of Roach Abbey, and it concludes a memorable line, "It would pity any hearts to see," when he recounts the pillaging of the monastery. Now, that's not because they thought ill of the monks, it's just all this stuff is going free and you'd be a fool to go and take it.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, this particular thing that I've already sort of showed is interesting as well, because as you can see, the men here are standing in what was the refectory, but even at this point in the 19th century already no longer exists. So all we have is one of the walls that's now forming the wall of a house that's built adjacent to it. So the house that's sort of behind it in a way. And it would have already been in the 19th century private property. And so it seems that sometime around the early part of the 20th century, the sculpture was sold by whoever owned the land at that time, and it then entered the Brumer collection, and then it was actually at the Met for decades before they deaccessioned it. So it's a, that's sort of one sort of example from out of England. But I'm aware that we've been going for over an hour, and so I thought we'd open the floor up to just a couple of questions, because I think can see that we're kind of starting to lose people. And so I have a couple of questions here. Some I think that have already been answered by our discussion. Just to remind people of the gallery name. So our gallery is called Sam Fogg, and we are on Clifford Street, 15D Clifford Street in Mayfair, just behind the Royal Academy. So another question that I have here is, which orders were the mendicants and which were the theologians? I don't know if you want to take that question.
Really interesting. Well, mendicants, they live by begging. Now, that's the friars, like the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Carmelites, the Austin friars. They're not supposed to own any property at all. Churches are vested in the care of someone else, and they're meant to live by alms. Now, theologians you find in all the orders. There are some very, very distinguished Dominican theologians. Gosh, we've got a great anniversary for Thomas Aquinas this year, I think. And but then you find great theologians in other orders as well. That learning isn't discrete to one order. Some orders have come out of the Middle Ages with a reputation for being more scholarly than others. For instance, the Dominicans, but none of them are anti-intellectual, and they all produce their own theologians.
Yeah. We then have another question that's sort of related. It's actually a really interesting one, which we didn't sort of touch upon. So when the canons or friars went out into the community, did they preach in the open air or in houses? And was their work really necessary? Because every parish had a church, and many larger towns, a monastery, where presumably preaching to the community could take place as well. So I don't know.
Really interesting about the evangelizing role of the friars. And, you know, and yes, they are thought to be necessary. You know, it's like, it's Francis rebuilding God's church, isn't it? You know, it's, to take orthodox Catholic belief to the people. And it's partly because the parish system, well, yeah, people, every Christian belonged to a parish, but how good was the kind of care the spiritual care being provided by the parishes as well? There was definitely preaching out in the open air, but they were also preaching within the churchyards of Franciscan and other mendicant churches as well. And you often get images of Bernardino of Siena, sometimes in a church, in a town square as well, in a specially built pulpit. So yeah, I think that the evangelizing role was very, very important indeed. Now, one thing to say about a lot of monastic churches is that the access of the laity to them was actually quite strictly regulated. Certainly the case with Cistercian churches, and often the case with a lot of Benedictine churches as well. You know, you couldn't get access to very much of it at all. Monks on the whole did not have a pastoral or evangelizing responsibilities. Sometimes you have them with a care for a parish or things like that, but on the whole, no, they didn't. It was about them, about their community. Yeah,
no, incredible. I mean, as a bridge expert, just to contribute something, there's an interesting fact that in Paris, on the Petit Pont, is where some of the preaching took place as well. So they also preached on bridges, because bridges were important places. You know, that's where you're gonna get a lot of people to listen to you. And one last comment that I just wanted to read is, so an anonymous attendee asks the name of James Clark's book. I think it's just called The Dissolution of the Monasteries. Okay, there you go. Yeah, published in 2021, I think it was, yeah. Okay, The Dissolution of the Monasteries by James Clark, Yale University Press, yeah. Great, thank you. And another comment says, this has been a super talk. I could listen to Michael all evening. And I think with that, I think we should probably say goodbye, as we've sort of taken this 10 minutes over. But thank you so much, Michael. You are a well of knowledge, and this has been so amazing. And I've learned so much from you, and I'm sure all of our listeners have as well. It's been an absolute joy. And if you want to know more about monasteries of its time, so go to the English Heritage website, or even better, become a member and visit some of our sites. Mark is all thanking me for that. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, thank you. Just to remind everyone, so this is the last talk for London Art Week, but these talks are recorded and will be posted on the London Art Week's website, and also on our website on samfogg.com. We have a section called Learn. And if you have any other questions, I've been told you can also write them directly, or write them into the Q&A or directly to London Art Week, and they will forward them on to us. But thank you so much, everyone, and come to the exhibition. It opens on the 26th of April, which is a Wednesday, called Those Who Pray, in our gallery in Mayfair, 15D Clifford Street, and it runs on for about a month, so it closes on the 26th of May. Thank you.